Girl stops elderly man's groceries, delivers a secret note. What it said shocked everyone. I hope you're having a great day. Enjoy the story. In the quiet town of Maplewood, where the rustling of leaves often spoke louder than its inhabitants, lived a little girl named Lily. At 7 years old, Lily had already learned the weight of silence. Her world had shifted dramatically 2 years ago when her mother, Claire, passed away unexpectedly. Since then, the Thompson household had been shrouded in a heavy quietude that seemed to seep into every corner of their modest 2-story home. Lily's father, Michael, did his best to care for her, but grief had transformed their once lively home into a place where words were scarce and emotions even scarcer. Breakfast was eaten in silence, with only the clink of spoons against cereal, bowls breaking the morning stillness. Dinners were equally quiet affairs, the scraping of forks against plates a poor substitute for conversation. And at night, as Lily lay in bed, the only lullaby she heard was the whisper of wind against her bedroom window. In this new, silent world, Lily had learned to seek out noise in places others overlooked. She found comfort in the muffled conversations of neighbors floating through open windows, in the rustle of grocery bags being carried down the street, and in the metallic symphony of coins exchanged at the supermarket checkout. It was during one of her daily observations at Maplewood Market that Lily first noticed him, an elderly man who seemed as out of place in the bustling store as she felt in her silent home. Every day, at precisely 3:15 p.m., he would shuffle into the market, his weathered hands gripping a worn leather wallet. His routine never varied. 5 apples, a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a small bunch of flowers. He always paid with carefully folded bills, smoothing each one out as if it held some precious memory. But what truly caught Lily's attention was the way the old man hesitated before speaking, as if each word was a heavy stone he had to lift and place carefully. His eyes, a pale blue that reminded Lily of faded denim, would dart around nervously before settling on the checkout clerk. And then, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders would slump, and he'd leave without uttering a single word. No one else seemed to notice this daily drama. The other customers were too busy with their own lives, their own shopping lists, their own worries. But Lily noticed. She noticed everything these days. One sweltering summer afternoon, as Lily perched on the bench outside the market, licking a rapidly melting ice cream cone, she saw the old man emerge from the store. His arms were laden with more bags than usual, and he stumbled slightly under their weight. Without thinking, Lily jumped up, sticky ice cream forgotten, and ran to his side. "Can I help you carry those, sir?" she asked, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. It had been so long since she'd spoken to anyone outside of school or home. The old man startled, nearly dropping a bag of apples. His faded blue eyes widened as they met Lily's earnest brown ones. For a moment, he seemed frozen in place, as if unsure how to respond to this unexpected kindness. Then, slowly, he nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. As they walked side by side down the sun-dappled sidewalk, Lily's curiosity got the better of her. "Do you live alone?" she asked, then immediately wished she could take back the words. Her father had always told her it was impolite to pry. The old man hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to see something far away. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. They continued in silence until they reached a small, well-kept house at the end of Maple Street. As the old man fumbled with his keys, Lily caught a glimpse through the open door. Her eyes were drawn to a table just inside the entryway, where a crumpled envelope lay. It looked as if it had been folded and unfolded hundreds of times, the creases deep and worn. What caught her attention, though, was the name scrawled across the front in shaky handwriting. It was the name of the checkout clerk at Maplewood Market. Lily's mind whirled with questions. If the old man went to the market every day, why did he never speak to the clerk? Why did he have her name on an envelope that looked so old and well handled? That night, as Lily lay in bed, the silence of her house seemed even more oppressive than usual. Her mind kept returning to the old man, to the envelope, to the unspoken, words that seemed to hang in the air around him. For the first time in a long while, Lily felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced since her mother died, curiosity about the world beyond her quiet, grief-stricken home. As she drifted off to sleep, Lily made a decision. She would unravel the mystery of the old man and the envelope. Little did she know that this simple act of kindness and curiosity would set in motion a chain of events that would change not only her life, but the lives of those around her in ways she could never have imagined. In the days that followed, Lily found herself drawn back to Maplewood Market each afternoon. She would perch on the bench outside, her small legs swinging back and forth, waiting for the familiar figure of the old man to appear. As she observed him more closely, she began to notice details she had missed before. His name, she learned from overhearing a conversation between two cashiers, was Mr. Abernathy. He always wore the same faded blue sweater, no matter how warm the day, and a pair of well-worn brown loafers that scuffed softly against the linoleum floors of the market. His hair, what little was left of it, was a soft white that reminded Lily of dandelion fluff. But it was his eyes that fascinated Lily the most. They seemed to hold a world of unspoken words, of stories longing to be told. When he looked at the checkout clerk, whose name tag read Margaret, his gaze was filled with a mixture of longing and regret that Lily couldn't quite understand, but felt deep in her chest. One particularly warm afternoon, as Mr. Abernathy made his way through the automatic doors of the market, Lily decided to follow him inside. She trailed behind him at a discreet distance, watching as he methodically made his way through the aisles. He moved slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for items on the shelves. Lily noticed how he would pause in front of the flower display, his fingers ghosting over the vibrant petals of daisies and carnations before finally selecting a small bunch of forget-me-nots. As he approached the checkout, Lily held her breath. Would today be the day he finally spoke to Margaret? She watched as he placed his items on the conveyor belt, his movements deliberate and careful. Margaret smiled at him, the same warm smile she gave to all her customers, but Lily noticed how her eyes lingered on Mr. Abernathy a moment longer than necessary. "Good afternoon, Mr. Abernathy," Margaret said, her voice kind. "Did you find everything you needed today?" Mr. Abernathy's mouth opened, then closed. His hand reached into his pocket, and for a moment Lily thought he might pull out the mysterious envelope. But instead he simply nodded, his eyes cast downward as Margaret rang up his purchases. As she handed him his change, their fingers brushed for the briefest of moments. Lily saw both of them start at the contact, a flicker of something, recognition, longing, passing between them. But then the moment was gone, and Mr. Abernathy was shuffling towards the exit, his plastic bags rustling softly. Lily's heart sank. Another day, another missed opportunity. She couldn't understand why Mr. Abernathy never spoke to Margaret. Why he held back the words that seemed to be bursting to escape. It reminded her, in a way she couldn't quite articulate, of the silence that had descended on her own home after her mother's death. As she followed Mr. Abernathy out of the store, Lily made a decision. She would help him. Somehow, some way, she would find out what was in that envelope and why he couldn't bring himself to give it to Margaret. Little did Lily know that her innocent determination would soon uncover a story of love, loss, and second chances that had been waiting decades to be told. As she skipped home that afternoon, her mind buzzing with plans and possibilities, Lily had no idea that she was about to embark on a journey that would not only change Mr. Abernathy's life, but would also help her confront the silence in her own heart. The following day dawned bright and clear, the kind of summer morning that seemed to promise adventure. Lily woke early, her mind still turning over the mystery of Mr. Abernathy and Margaret. She went through her morning routine, mechanically, barely tasting her cereal as she pondered how she could help the old man find his voice. As she was about to leave for her daily visit to the market, her father's voice stopped her. "Lily," Michael called from the kitchen, his tone hesitant. "I was thinking, maybe we could go to the park today. It's been a while since we've done something together." Lily paused, her hand on the doorknob. A part of her yearned to say yes, to spend time with her father, and maybe, just maybe, break through the wall of silence that had grown between them. But the image of Mr. Abernathy's sad eyes flashed in her mind, and she knew she couldn't abandon her mission. "Maybe tomorrow, Dad," she said, not meeting his eyes. I have something important to do today." She didn't wait to see the disappointment on his face. closing the door quickly behind her. As she walked to the market, Lily felt a twinge of guilt. She loved her father, but ever since her mother died, it was as if they were speaking different languages, unable to bridge the gap between them. When she arrived at the market, Lily was surprised to see Mr. Abernathy already there, earlier than his usual time. He seemed agitated, his movements more hurried and less precise than normal. As he reached for a bunch of flowers, his elbow knocked against a display of apples, sending several rolling across the floor. Lily rushed forward to help gathering the scattered fruit. As she handed them back to Mr. Abernathy, she noticed something flutter to the ground from his pocket. It was a yellowed piece of paper, folded and refolded so many times that the creases were worn almost to breaking. Before she could stop herself, Lily picked it up. Her eyes skimmed over the faded, handwritten words. "I have wasted too much time. If there is still a chance, I must see it before it is too late." Mr. Abernathy's hand shot out, snatching the paper from her grasp. His eyes, usually so sad and distant, were now sharp with fear and something else. Shame. "I'm sorry," Lily stammered, taken aback by his sudden movement. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted to help." Mr. Abernathy's expression softened as he looked at the little girl. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again, shaking his head. With trembling hands, he carefully refolded the paper and tucked it back into his pocket. As Lily watched him shuffle away, her mind was racing. The words on that paper, they were clearly important, clearly meant for someone. And given the way Mr. Abernathy looked at Margaret every day, Lily had a pretty good idea who that someone might be. But why hadn't he given it to her? Why carry around those words for so long without ever speaking them? That night, as Lily lay in bed, her thoughts kept returning to the note. Its words seemed to echo in her mind, stirring something deep within her. Suddenly she sat up, her heart pounding. She remembered something, a memory she had pushed down so deep she had almost forgotten it. The day her mother died, she had left a letter for Lily. But in her grief and confusion, Lily had never found the courage to read it. The letter still sat in her drawer, unopened, unread. Lily's chest tightened as the realization hit her. She was doing the same thing as Mr. Abernathy, holding on to words unsaid, afraid of what they might mean, what they might change. In that moment, Lily made a decision. She would help Mr. Abernathy deliver his note to Margaret. And maybe, just maybe, in doing so, she would find the courage to face her own unread words. As she drifted off to sleep, Lily's mind was filled with plans. She didn't know how, but she was determined to bring these two people together, to give voice to the silence that had kept them apart for so long. Little did she know that in trying to help Mr. Abernathy, she would embark on a journey that would not only change his life, but would also help her confront the silence in her own heart. The next few days saw Lily embarking on her self-appointed mission with the determination only a 7-year-old could muster. She spent hours at the market, observing Mr. Abernathy and Margaret, trying to piece together their story from the fragments she could gather. It was during one of these observation sessions that Lily overheard a conversation between two elderly ladies in the produce section. They were discussing the upcoming town festival, reminiscing about past celebrations. "Do you remember the summer? Fair of '65, one of them asked, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "That was the year old Tom Abernathy won the pie-eating contest. Lord, I've never seen anyone so covered in blueberries." Lily's ears perked up at the mention of Mr. Abernathy's name. She inched closer, pretending to be deeply interested in a display of carrots. The other woman chuckled. "Oh, yes, I remember. He was trying to impress that pretty young thing he was sweet on. What was her name again? Mary? Maggie? Margaret," the first woman corrected. "Margaret Collins. She worked at her father's bookstore back then. Those two were inseparable that summer. Everyone thought they'd end up married." Lily's heart raced. Margaret Collins. It had to be the same Margaret, who worked at the checkout counter. But if they had been so close, what had happened? Why weren't they together now? "Whatever happened to them?" the second woman asked, echoing Lily's thoughts. "I heard Tom went off to college in the fall, and when he came back..." But before Lily could hear the rest, A store clerk approached, asking if the ladies needed any help. Frustrated at the interruption, Lily slipped away, her mind whirling with this new information. That afternoon, as she waited for Mr. Abernathy to make his daily appearance, Lily found herself looking at Margaret with new eyes. She noticed the way the older woman's gaze would sometimes drift to the store entrance, a fleeting look of expectation crossing her face. She saw how Margaret's smile would brighten just a little when Mr. Abernathy shuffled in, only to dim again, when he left without a word. When Mr. Abernathy finally arrived, Lily made a bold decision. She approached him as he was selecting his usual bunch of forget-me-nots. "Mr. Abernathy," she said softly, causing him to start slightly. I was wondering if you could tell me about the summer fair of 1965. The effect of her words was immediate and startling. Mr. Abernathy's face paled, and the flowers slipped from his grasp, scattering across the floor. His eyes, usually so guarded, were suddenly filled with a tumult of emotions: surprise, fear, and beneath it all a deep, aching sadness. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Lily feared she had made a terrible mistake. But then, to her amazement, he spoke, his voice rough with disuse and emotion. 1965, he whispered, more to himself than to Lily. That was the summer everything changed. He looked down at Lily, really seeing her for perhaps the first time. "How do you know about that?" Lily stammered, suddenly unsure of herself. I overheard some ladies talking. They mentioned you and Margaret." At the sound of Margaret's name, Mr. Abernathy's eyes darted involuntarily to the checkout counter. Margaret was there, ringing up a customer's groceries, unaware of the drama unfolding just a few aisles away. "That was a long time ago," Mr. Abernathy said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "A different life." He bent down with difficulty to gather the scattered flowers. Lily hurried to help him, her small hands gently collecting the delicate blooms. As she handed them back to Mr. Abernathy, Lily gathered her courage. "The note in your pocket," she said softly. "It's for her, isn't it? For Margaret?" Mr. Abernathy's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with a sadness so profound it made Lily's heart ache. "Yes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. As Mr. Abernathy's admission hung in the air between them, Lily felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. She had uncovered part of the mystery, but she sensed there was still so much more to learn. "Why haven't you given it to her?" Lily asked, her voice gentle but insistent. Mr. Abernathy sighed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of unspoken words. He glanced around as if ensuring no one else could overhear, then gestured to a nearby bench. "Perhaps we should sit down, young lady. It's a long story." As they settled onto the bench, Mr. Abernathy cradled the bunch of forget-me-nots in his lap, his fingers absently stroking the delicate blue petals. For a moment he seemed lost in thought, his eyes distant and unfocused. "Margaret and I," he began hesitantly, "we were childhood sweethearts, grew up right here in Maplewood, went to school together, shared our first kiss behind the old oak tree in the town square." A ghost of a smile flickered across his face at the memory. Lily listened intently, trying to imagine a younger version of the man before her, full of life and love. "That summer of '65, I thought I had it all figured out," Mr. Abernathy continued. "I was headed off to college in the fall, but I was sure Margaret and I would make it work. We'd write letters, visit on holidays. I even—" He paused, swallowing hard. "I even bought a ring. Was planning to propose before I left." Lily's eyes widened. "But you didn't," she guessed. Mr. Abernathy shook his head, his expression clouding. "No, I didn't. I got scared. Thought maybe I was too young, that I should experience more of the world before settling down. So I left without saying anything, telling myself I'd propose when the time was right." He fell silent for a moment, lost in the memories of a different time, a different self. Lily waited patiently, sensing there was more to the story. "At college, I got caught up in my studies, in new experiences. I wrote to Margaret less and less, and then—" He trailed off, his voice thick with emotion. "And then I heard she'd started seeing someone else. I was heartbroken, but I told myself it was for the best that we'd both moved on." Lily frowned, confused. "But you came back, didn't you?" You're here now. Mr. Abernathy nodded slowly. Yes, I came back. Years later, after my career had ended and my own marriage had failed, I came back to Maplewood hoping to make peace with my past. And there she was, Margaret, still here, still beautiful. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the worn piece of paper. I wrote this the day I saw her again. I was going to give it to her, to explain everything, to see if there was still a chance. But when the moment came, he trailed, off, shaking his head. What stopped you? Lily asked softly. Mary Abernathy's eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of regret and fear. Time, he said simply. Too much time had passed. I'd hurt her once before, disappearing from her life. What right did I have to come back now, decades later, and potentially disrupt her life again? No, it was better to stay silent, to spare her any more pain. Lily's young mind struggled to fully grasp the complexity of adult relationships and the weight of decades of regret. But she understood one thing clearly. Mr. Abernathy was lonely, and his heart still yearned for Margaret. But don't you think she deserves to know? Lily pressed gently. Maybe she's been waiting too? Mr. Abernathy's gaze drifted to the store entrance, where Margaret could be seen assisting a customer. Perhaps, he murmured, almost to himself. But after all this time, how could I possibly find the words? As Lily watched the play of emotions across Mr. Abernathy's face, she felt a renewed determination. She may not understand everything about love and time and regret, but she knew that some words needed to be spoken, some truths needed to be shared. I could help you, she offered impulsively. I could give her the note for you. Mr. Abernathy looked at her in surprise, a flicker of hope crossing his face before doubt clouded his expression once more. I don't know, child, it's not that simple. But Lily was not to be deterred. Sometimes the simplest actions are the most important, she said, echoing words her mother had once told her. Please, Mr. Abernathy, let me help. As the old man looked into Lily's earnest face, something seemed to shift in his eyes. The fear and doubt were still there, but alongside them now was a tiny spark of hope, of possibility. All right, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. All right. We'll try it your way. As Lily left the market that day, her heart was light with excitement and purpose. She had a mission now, a way to help two people find their way back to each other. But as she walked home, a small part of her wondered if she could be brave enough to help Mr. Abernathy face his past. Could she find the courage to face her own? The thought of her mother's unopened letter weighed heavily on her mind as she made her way through the quiet streets of Maplewood. The days that followed were a whirlwind of planning and nervous anticipation for Lily. She spent hours strategizing the perfect moment to deliver Mr. Abernathy's note to Margaret, all while grappling with her own internal struggle over her mother's unopened letter. At home, the silence between Lily and her father seemed to grow even more pronounced. Michael noticed his daughter's distraction, her frequent absences, but found himself at a loss for how to bridge the gap between them. He would open his mouth to ask her about her day, only to close it again, unsure of how to form the words that once came so easily. One evening, as Lily picked at her dinner, Michael finally broke the silence. "Lily," he said hesitantly, "is everything all right? You've been different lately." Lily looked up, startled by the sudden question. She considered telling her father about Mr. Abernathy and Margaret, about the note and her plan to deliver it, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she explain something she barely understood herself? "I'm fine, Dad," she mumbled, pushing her peas around her plate. "Just thinking about stuff." Michael nodded, clearly unsatisfied but unsure how to press further. The silence descended once more, broken only by the scrape of forks against plates. As Lily lay in bed that night, she found herself thinking about the parallels between her situation and Mr. Abernathy's. Both of them were holding on to words unsaid, afraid of what might happen if they let them out. The weight of her mother's unopened letter seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. The next afternoon, Lily arrived at the market earlier than usual. She wanted to observe Margaret without Mr. Abernathy present, to try and gauge the best moment to approach her with the note. As she wandered the aisles, Pretending to be interested in the colorful displays of fruit and vegetables, Lily overheard a conversation between Margaret and another cashier during a lull in customers. "You know, Marge," the younger woman was saying, "I've always wondered about that old man who comes in every day, the one who never says a word." Margaret's hands stilled on the register she was cleaning. "Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "What about him?" The other cashier leaned in conspiratorially. "Well, I heard from Mrs. Jensen that he used to be quite the catch back in the day. Wasn't there some story about you two?" Lily held her breath, inching closer to hear Margaret's response. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on some distant point. When she spoke, her voice was soft, tinged with an emotion Lily couldn't quite identify. "That was a long time ago, Sarah. People change. Life moves on." But there was something in Margaret's tone, a catch in her voice, that made Lily wonder if life had truly moved on for either of them. As closing time approached, Lily saw her opportunity. Margaret was alone at her register, the store nearly empty. With shaking hands, Lily pulled Mr. Abernathy's note from her pocket. She had promised him she wouldn't read it, but the temptation to peek at the words that had remained unspoken for so long was almost overwhelming. Taking a deep breath, Lily approached the counter. "Excuse me, Miss Margaret," she said, her voice quavering slightly. Margaret looked down, surprise registering on her face as she recognized the little girl who had been Mr. Abernathy's frequent companion lately. "Yes, dear? Can I help you with something?" Lily's heart was pounding so hard she was sure Margaret must be able to hear it. I have something for you," she managed to say, holding out the worn piece of paper. "It's from Mr. Abernathy." Margaret's eyes widened, her hand freezing midway to taking the note. For a moment, she looked almost afraid, as if the paper might burn her if she touched it. "He wanted you to have this," Lily pressed on, her voice gaining strength. "He's wanted to give it to you for a long time, but he was scared." Slowly, as if in a dream, Margaret reached out and took the note. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the faded words. Lily watched as a range of emotions played across Margaret's face. Surprise, pain, and finally, a deep, shaking sadness that made Lily's own heart clench in sympathy. "Oh, Tom," Margaret whispered, a single tear sliding down her cheek. In that moment, as Lily watched the impact of words finally spoken after decades of silence, she felt something shift inside her. She thought of her own unread letter, of the words her mother had left for her waiting to be heard. As she turned to leave, giving Margaret privacy to absorb the contents of the note, Lily made a decision. It was time for her to be as brave as she had encouraged Mr. Abernathy to be. It was time to face her own unspoken words. With a mixture of fear and determination, Lily headed home, knowing that her own moment of truth was waiting for her in the drawer by her bed. The weight of silence was about to be broken, not just for Mr. Abernathy and Margaret, but for Lily herself. The walk home from the market that evening felt different to Lily. The familiar streets of Maplewood seemed charged with a new energy, as if the very air around her was alive with the possibility of change. Her mind raced with thoughts of Margaret's reaction to the note, wondering what would happen next between her and Mr. Abernathy. But underneath it all, a steady drumbeat of determination pushed her forward. She had made a decision, and now it was time to follow through. As Lily approached her house, she saw her father's car in the driveway. A pang of guilt shot through her as she realized how little time she'd spent at home lately, how distant she'd been from the one person who was supposed to be closest to her. Taking a deep breath, Lily pushed open the front door. "Dad?" she called out, her voice echoing in the quiet house. "I'm home." Michael appeared in the hallway, a dish towel in his hands. "Hey, sweetie," he said, a tentative smile on his face. "I was just about to start dinner. How about we cook together tonight?" For a moment, Lily was tempted to say no, to rush upstairs and retrieve her mother's letter. But something in her father's eyes, a mixture of hope and uncertainty, made her pause. "Sure, Dad," she said, managing a small smile of her own. "That sounds nice." As they worked side by side in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and stirring sauce, Lily felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in a long time. The silence between them was still there, but it felt less oppressive somehow, as if it was slowly beginning to thaw. Over dinner, Lily found herself opening up bit by bit. She told her father about Mr. Abernathy and Margaret, about the note and her role in delivering it. Michael listened attentively, asking questions and offering gentle insights. "That was a very brave thing you did, Lily," he said softly when she had finished her story, "helping Mr. Abernathy face his past like that." Lily pushed her food around, her plate gathering her courage. "Dad," she said hesitantly, "do you remember the letter Mom left for me? The one I never read?" Michael's fork clattered against his plate, his face paling slightly. "Yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I remember. I think—" Lily took a deep breath. "I think I'm ready to read it now." The look that passed between father and daughter in that moment was one of understanding, of shared grief and tentative hope. Michael reached across the table, taking Lily's small hand in his own. "Whenever you're ready," he said gently. "I'll be right here with you." After dinner, Lily climbed the stairs to her room, her heart pounding with each step. The drawer where she had kept her mother's letter for 2 years seemed to loom before her, both beckoning and threatening. With trembling hands, she pulled it open and retrieved the envelope. Her name was written on the front in her mother's, familiar handwriting, the sight of it bringing a lump to her throat. Lily sat on her bed, the letter in her lap. She could hear her father moving around downstairs, the quiet sounds of him cleaning up after dinner providing a comforting backdrop. Taking a deep breath, Lily broke the seal of the envelope and unfolded the letter within. "My dearest Lily," it began, and Lily felt tears spring to her eyes at the sound of her mother's voice in her head. As she read, Lily felt as if a dam had broken inside her. All the emotions she had held back for 2 years, the grief, the anger, the confusion, came pouring out. Her mother's words, full of love and hope for Lily's future, washed over her like a healing balm. When she reached the end of the letter, Lily was sobbing openly, her tears falling onto the paper and blurring the ink, but mixed with her sadness was a sense of release, of a burden finally lifted. "Lily?" Her father's voice came from the doorway, concern evident in his tone. "Are you okay?" Looking up, Lily saw her father standing there, his own eyes glistening, with unshed tears. Without a word, she held out her arms, and Michael crossed the room in 2 strides, enveloping her in a tight embrace. As father and daughter clung to each other, their shared grief finally finding expression, something shifted in the Thompson household. The silence that had reigned for so long began to crack, letting in the first rays of healing light. Meanwhile, across town, another long-held silence was being broken. In her small apartment above the market, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, Mr. Abernathy's note spread out before her. Her fingers traced the faded words as she read them again and again, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. And in his own home, Mr. Abernathy paced nervously, wondering what the morning would bring. Would Margaret speak to him? Would she even want to see him? The uncertainty was agonizing, but beneath it all was a sense of lightness, of a secret finally shared. As night fell over Maplewood, 3 separate households found themselves on the brink of change. The words that had gone unspoken for so long had finally been released, and in their wake, new possibilities were blooming. Little did they know that their stories, so long separate, were about to intertwine in ways none of them could have imagined. The turning point had arrived, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The morning after Lily read her mother's letter dawned bright and clear, the world outside her window seeming somehow fresher, more vibrant than before. As she made her way downstairs, Lily felt a strange mixture of emotions, sadness for the loss she had finally allowed herself to fully feel, but also a sense of lightness, as if a great weight had been lifted from her small shoulders. In the faux kitchen, she found her father already up, busy at the stove. The smell of pancakes filled the air, a scent that brought back a rush of memories. Saturday morning pancakes had been a family tradition, one that had fallen by the wayside after her mother's death. "Good morning, sweetheart," Michael said, turning to greet her with a smile that was both hopeful and hesitant. I thought maybe we could revive an old tradition. If you want to, that is. Lily felt a lump form in her throat. I'd like that, Dad, she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. As they sat down to eat, the silence between them felt different, no longer a barrier, but a space filled with shared understanding. They ate slowly, savoring not just the food, but the moment of connection. Lily, Michael said finally, setting down his fork, I want you to know how proud I am of you. What you did yesterday, reading your mother's letter, telling me about it, that took a lot of courage. Lily felt a warmth spread through her chest at her father's words. Thanks, Dad, she said softly. Then, gathering her courage, she added, I was thinking maybe we could talk about Mom sometimes. I miss her, and I don't want to forget. Michael's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but he nodded. I'd like that very much, sweetheart. I miss her too, every day. As they continued their breakfast, the conversation flowed more easily than it had in years. They shared memories of Claire, laughing at funny stories and comforting each other through the sad ones. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, of grief threatening to overwhelm them, but it was a start. Meanwhile, across town, another story was unfolding. Margaret had barely slept, Mr. Abernathy's words running through her mind on an endless loop. As she opened the market that morning, her hands shook slightly, her eyes constantly darting to the door. When Mr. Abernathy finally appeared, later than his usual time, the air between them seemed to crackle with tension. He approached the counter slowly, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. Margaret, he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. I suppose we should talk. Margaret nodded, her heart pounding. Yes, Tom, I think we should. As they stepped away from the counter, finding a quiet corner of the store, neither noticed the small figure watching from behind a display of cereal boxes. Lily, having convinced her father to bring her to the market, held her breath as she watched the scene unfold. The conversation between Mr. Abernathy and Margaret was too quiet for Lily to hear, but she could see the play of emotions across their faces. Pain, regret, and underneath it all, a flicker of something that looked a lot like hope. As Lily watched, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Turning, she found herself face to face with her father. Spying isn't very polite, you know, Michael said, but there was a twinkle in his eye that took the sting out of his words. Lily blushed, caught out. I just wanted to make sure they were okay, she mumbled. Michael's expression softened as he looked from his daughter to the elderly couple deep in conversation. Sometimes, he said gently, people need a little push to face the things they've been avoiding. You gave them that push, Lily. That's a pretty amazing thing. As they turned to leave, giving Mr. Abernathy and Margaret their privacy, Lily felt a surge of warmth in her chest. She had set out to help two strangers find their voice, but in doing so, she had found her own. The days that followed saw a gradual but noticeable shift in the town of Maplewood. Mr. Abernathy and Margaret were seen together more often, their interactions no longer limited to silent exchanges over grocery purchases. They could be spotted walking in the park, sharing a bench and conversation, their faces animated as they bridged the gap of years with words too long left unspoken. At the Thompson household, the change was equally profound. The silence that had reigned for so long was slowly being filled with conversation, with shared memories and new experiences. Michael and Lily began to rediscover each other, finding ways to honor Claire's memory while also moving forward. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Michael turned to his daughter. You know, Lily, he said thoughtfully, I've been thinking about what you did for Mr. Abernathy and Margaret. It got me wondering if maybe there's something we could do for others who might be struggling with loss or loneliness. Lily looked up at her father, intrigued. What do you mean, Dad? Michael smiled, a hint of excitement in his eyes. Well, I was thinking maybe we could start a community group, a place where people could come together, share their stories, help each other through tough times. What do you think? Lily's face lit up at the idea. That sounds amazing, Dad. Could I help? I was hoping you'd say that, Michael said, ruffling her hair affectionately. I think you have a special gift for helping people open up. We could really make a difference together. As they sat there, planning and dreaming, Lily felt a sense of purpose and connection she hadn't experienced in a long time. She thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. A simple act of kindness, a long-held secret finally revealed, the courage to face painful truths. She realized that in helping Mr. Abernathy and Margaret break their silence, she had not only changed their lives, but had set in motion a transformation in her own life and in the community around her. The ripples of that one small action were spreading outward, touching lives in ways she could never have imagined. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Lily felt a deep sense of contentment. The silence that had once seemed so oppressive had been replaced by something beautiful. The sound of healing, of connection, of life moving forward. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, moments of sadness and struggle, but she also knew that she no longer had to face them alone. With her father by her side, and with the strength she had discovered within herself, Lily felt ready to embrace whatever the future might hold. As darkness fell over Maplewood, the town seemed to hum with a new energy, the energy of secrets shared, of bridges rebuilt, of hope rekindled. And at the heart of it all was a little girl who had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply to speak, to listen, and to care. As summer began to fade into autumn, the changes in Maplewood continued to unfold like the changing colors of the leaves. The community group that Michael and Lily had envisioned quickly became a reality, growing from a small gathering in the local library to a thriving network of support and friendship. Lily threw herself into the project with all the enthusiasm of her 7 years. She helped design colorful flyers, distributed them around town, and even gave a shy but heartfelt speech at the first meeting, sharing her own experience of loss and the importance of breaking the silence that often surrounds grief. The group, which they named Maplewood Connections, became a safe haven for many in the town who had been struggling silently with their own pain. There were elderly widows and widowers, parents who had lost children, and even children like Lily who were navigating the complex world of grief. Mr. Abernathy and Margaret became regular attendees, their story of reconnection after years of silence serving as an inspiration to many. They often shared how Lily's simple act of delivering a note had been the catalyst for their renewed relationship, causing many in the group to look at the little girl with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. One crisp Saturday morning, as Lily and her father were setting up chairs for the weekly meeting, Mr. Abernathy approached them, Margaret by his side. "Lily, Michael," he said, his voice stronger and more confident than Lily had ever heard it. "Margaret and I have been talking, and we have an idea we'd like to run by you." Michael raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's on your mind, Tom?" Margaret stepped forward, her eyes bright with excitement. "We were thinking about all the people in our group who have trouble getting out of the house, the elderly, the disabled, those without transportation. What if we could bring a bit of Maplewood Connections to them?" Mr. Abernathy nodded, picking up the thread. "We could start a visitation program. Volunteers from the group could visit those who can't make it to meetings, spend some time with them, maybe bring them a hot meal or some groceries." Lily's face lit up at the idea. "That's brilliant," she exclaimed. "We could call it, Maplewood Reach Out." The adults laughed at her enthusiasm, but the name stuck. Within weeks, Maplewood Reach Out was up and running, with volunteers fanning out across the town, bringing companionship and support to those who needed it most. Lily often accompanied her father on these visits, her natural empathy and curiosity making her a favorite among the homebound members of their community. She would sit for hours, listening to stories of lives lived long before she was born, asking questions and offering comfort in her own unique way. One particularly memorable visit was to Mrs. Henderson, a 92-year-old woman who lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. As Lily helped her father carry in a basket of groceries, she was struck by the silence of the house, broken only by the ticking of an old grandfather clock. "Hello, Mrs. Henderson," Michael called out as they entered. "It's Michael and Lily Thompson from Maplewood Connections. We've brought you some groceries and thought we might stay for a chat if that's all right with you." There was a shuffling sound from the living room, and then a frail voice called out, "Come in, come in. It's so good to hear voices in this old house again." As they entered the living room, Lily's eyes widened. Every surface was covered with framed photographs, old black and white images, faded color snapshots, recent digital prints. It was like walking into a museum of memories. Mrs. Henderson sat in an old armchair, a crocheted blanket over her knees. Her face lit up at the sight of her visitors, especially Lily. "Well, aren't you a sight for sore eyes?" she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Come closer, dear. These old eyes aren't what they used to be." As Lily approached, Mrs. Henderson reached out a gnarled hand to touch her face. "You remind me of my Sarah," she said softly. She had the same curious eyes. "Who's Sarah?" Lily asked, her gaze drawn to a photograph on the side table of a young woman with a bright smile. Mrs. Henderson's eyes misted over. "My daughter," she said. She passed away many years ago, car accident. I haven't spoken her name out loud in so long." Michael started to apologize to change the subject, but Lily surprised them both by climbing onto the arm of Mrs. Henderson's chair and pointing to the photograph. "Tell me about her," she said simply. "What was she like?" For a moment, Mrs. Henderson looked startled. Then a slow smile spread across her face. "Oh, she was a firecracker, my Sarah," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Always getting into mischief, but with a heart of gold." As Mrs. Henderson spoke, bringing Sarah to life through her stories, Lily noticed something changing in the room. The silence that had seemed so oppressive when they entered was retreating, replaced by the warm tones of remembrance and shared laughter. Michael watched in amazement as his daughter drew Mrs. Henderson out of her shell, asking questions about each photograph, listening with rapt attention to tales of a life fully lived. By the time they left, hours later, the old woman's eyes were shining. Her cheeks flushed with more color than they had seen in years. As they walked home in the gathering twilight, Michael put his arm around Lily's shoulders. "You did something really special back there, sweetheart," he said softly. Lily looked up at her father, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I just did what we do in our group, Dad," she said. "I listened. Sometimes that's all people need, someone to listen to their stories." Michael felt a surge of pride and love for his daughter. In helping others confront their silence, she had found her own voice, her own strength. And in doing so, she was helping to heal not just individual hearts, but the very fabric of their community. As they turned onto their street, the lights of homes glowing warmly in the dusk, Michael realized that Maplewood was changing. The silence that had once separated neighbors was being replaced by a growing network of care and connection. And at the heart of it all was a little girl who had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply to speak, to listen, and to care. The story of Lily, Mr. Abernathy, and Margaret was no longer just their own. It had become a catalyst for change, a reminder that it's never too late to break the silence, to reach out, to connect. As Maplewood Connections and Maplewood Reach Out continued to grow and thrive, the town was becoming a testament to the power of words spoken, of stories shared, of silences broken. And for Lily, each day brought new opportunities to learn, to grow, and to make a difference in the lives of those around her. The journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. As autumn deepened, painting Maplewood in rich hues of red and gold, the changes brought about by Lily's simple act of kindness continued to ripple through the community. The Maplewood Connections Group had become a cornerstone of town life, bringing together people from all walks of life to share their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs. One crisp October afternoon, as Lily helped her father set up for the weekly meeting, she noticed a new face hovering uncertainly at the door of the community center. It was a boy about her age, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Lily approached him with a warm smile. "Hi there, I'm Lily. Are you here for the meeting?" The boy nodded shyly. "Yeah, I'm Max. My mum thought it might be good for me to come, but—" He trailed off, his eyes darting around the room. "But it's a little scary," Lily finished for him. When Max nodded again, she continued, "I felt the same way at first. Want to sit with me? I can introduce you to everyone." As Lily led Max to a pair of chairs, She noticed Mr. Abernathy and Margaret entering the room, hand in hand. The sight still filled her with a sense of wonder and accomplishment. They caught her eye and waved, their faces lighting up with warm smiles. The meeting began, and Lily listened intently as people shared their stories. Some were sad, tales of loss and a loneliness that made her heart ache. Others were hopeful, speaking of new connections made and old wounds beginning to heal. Through it all, she kept a watchful eye on Max, noticing how he seemed to relax as the meeting progressed. Towards the end of the session, Michael stood up to make an announcement. "I have some exciting news," he said, his voice filled with enthusiasm. "Thanks to the success of our Maplewood Reach-Out program, we've been approached by the neighboring town of Oakville. They want our help in setting up a similar program there." A murmur of excitement ran through the group. Lily felt a surge of pride. Their little initiative was growing, touching more lives than she could have imagined. As the meeting wound down, Lily turned to Max. "So, what did you think?" Max was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "It was nice. Everyone here seems so kind, and hearing their stories, it made me feel less alone." Lily nodded understandingly. "That's how I felt too. Do you want to talk about why you came?" Max hesitated, then slowly began to speak. "My dad, he left us a few months ago, just packed up and went away. Mom's been really sad and I didn't know how to help. I've been feeling so angry and confused, but I didn't want to make Mom more upset by talking about it." Lily felt a pang in her heart. She reached out and squeezed Max's hand. "I'm so sorry, Max, that must be really hard. You know, it's okay to feel angry and confused, and it's okay to talk about it too." Max looked at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Really? But what if it makes things worse?" "Sometimes," Lily said, thinking back to her own experience, "keeping things inside can make them feel bigger and scarier. Talking about them can help make them feel more manageable, and you're not alone anymore. We're all here to listen and help." As Max nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, Lily had an idea. "Hey, why don't you come with me and my dad on our next reach-out visit? We're going to see Mrs. Henderson tomorrow. She has the most amazing stories, and I think you'd really like her." Max's face lit up at the invitation. "Really? That sounds great." As they made plans for the next day, Lily felt a warm glow of satisfaction. She had come to realize that breaking the silence wasn't just about speaking. It was about creating spaces where people felt safe to share their truths, where they could find understanding and support. The next afternoon, as Lily, Max and Michael made their way to Mrs. Henderson's house, the air was crisp with the promise of the coming winter. Leaves crunched underfoot, and the scent of wood smoke hung in the air. Mrs. Henderson greeted them at the door, her face lighting up at the sight of Lily and the new addition to their group. "Well, hello there," she exclaimed, her eyes twinkling. "Who's this young man you've brought with you?" "This is Max," Lily introduced proudly. "He's new to Maplewood Connections, and I thought he'd enjoy meeting you and hearing your stories." As they settled into Mrs. Henderson's cozy living room, surrounded by her lifetime of photographs, Max's initial shyness began to melt away. Mrs. Henderson had a gift for putting people at ease, and soon she had both children captivated with tales of her youth. "You know," she said, gesturing to a faded photograph of a young couple, "my Harold and I weren't always the perfect pair, you might imagine. We had our fair share of arguments and misunderstandings, but do you know what got us through? Lily and—" Max shook their heads, hanging on her every word. "Communication," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "We learned to talk to each other, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. That's the secret, you see. Don't let the silence grow between you and the ones you love." As Mrs. Henderson continued to share her wisdom, Lily noticed a change in Max. He seemed more relaxed, more open. When Mrs. Henderson asked about his family, Max hesitated only briefly before sharing his story about his father leaving. To Lily's surprise, Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with understanding. "Oh, my dear boy," she said softly, "I know that pain. My own father left when I was just a bit younger than you. It's a hurt that runs deep." Max's eyes widened. "Really? What did you do?" Mrs. Henderson reached out and patted his hand. I did what you're doing right now, dear. I talked about it. I let myself feel the hurt, the anger, and slowly, with time and the love of those around me, I began to heal. As they left Mrs. Henderson's house that afternoon, Max was quiet, but there was a new lightness to his step. "Thank you," he said suddenly, turning to Lily, "for bringing me here. For everything." Lily smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "That's what friends are for," she said simply. Over the next few weeks, Max became a regular at Maplewood Connections meetings. Lily watched with pride as he gradually opened up, sharing more of his story and offering support to others in return. She saw the same transformation in him that she had experienced herself, the power of breaking silence, of sharing burdens, of connecting with others. One crisp November evening, as Lily and her father walked home from a particularly moving meeting, Michael turned to his daughter with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Lily," he said, "I've been thinking about how all of this started, with you helping Mr. Abernathy deliver that note to Margaret. It's amazing how one small act can set off such a chain of events." Lily nodded, her mind going back to that summer day that seemed so long ago now. "I was just trying to help," she said softly. "I didn't know it would turn into all of this." Michael smiled, putting his arm around her shoulders. "That's the thing about kindness, sweetheart. You never know how far it will reach. You've helped create something beautiful here in Maplewood, something that's bringing people together, helping them heal." As they walked in comfortable silence, Lily thought about all that had happened since that day in the market. She thought about Mr. Abernathy and Margaret, now rarely seen apart, about Mrs. Henderson, whose house was now filled with the voices of regular visitors, about Max, slowly healing and finding his voice, and she thought about herself and her father, how they had found their way back to each other through shared purpose and renewed communication. The silence that had once filled their home had been replaced by conversation, laughter, and the occasional disagreement, all signs of a relationship growing and strengthening. As they turned onto their street, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, dancing in the glow of the streetlights. Lily felt a sense of peace settle over her, a feeling of rightness with the world. She realized that in helping others break their silence, she had found her own voice, her own strength. And in doing so, she had not only changed her life, but had set in motion a transformation that was touching the entire community. The journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness was far from over. In fact, as Lily looked up at the star-filled sky, she knew it was only just beginning. There were more stories to be heard, more silences to be broken, more connections to be made, and she was ready for all of it. As winter settled over Maplewood, blanketing the town in a soft white silence, the warmth of connection continued to grow within the community. The Maplewood Connections group had become a beacon of hope and support, its influence spreading far beyond the original members. One snowy afternoon, as Lily and Max were helping to decorate the community center for the upcoming holiday gathering, they overheard a conversation between Michael and Mr. Abernathy that made them pause. "I still can't believe how much has changed," Mr. Abernathy was saying, his voice filled with wonder. "A few months ago I was a lonely old man, too afraid to speak to the woman I loved. And now," he trailed off, shaking his head in amazement. Michael nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It's remarkable, isn't it? How breaking one silence can lead to so many others being shattered." Lily and Max exchanged glances, both feeling a surge of pride at the part they had played in this transformation. They had seen firsthand how the simple act of speaking up, of sharing one's story, could ripple out and touch countless lives. As the holiday gathering approached, the excitement in Maplewood was palpable. It wasn't just the usual festive cheer. There was a deeper sense of community, of belonging, that seemed to touch everyone. The night of the gathering, the community center was alive with laughter, music, and the warm glow of candlelight. People from all walks of life mingled freely, sharing stories and joy. Lily watched in amazement as Mrs. Henderson, who had once been so isolated, held court in a corner, regaling a group of younger residents with tales of holidays past. Max, who had grown more confident with each passing week, was helping to serve refreshments, his shy smile now easy and frequent. Lily felt a warmth in her chest as she saw him chatting comfortably with other kids his age, the pain of his father's departure still present, but no longer all-consuming. As the evening wore on, Michael called for everyone's attention. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "When we started Maplewood Connections, we had no idea how much it would grow, how many lives it would touch. But looking around this room, I'm reminded of the power of community, of shared stories, of breaking the silences that keep us apart." He paused, his eyes finding Lily in the crowd. "And I want to give a special thanks to my daughter, Lily. It was her act of kindness, her desire to help two people find their voice, that started all of this. Lily, would you come up here for a moment?" Feeling a mix of embarrassment and pride, Lily made her way to the front of the room. As she stood beside her father, she saw faces filled with warmth and gratitude looking back at her. "Lily," Michael continued, "you've taught us all so much about the importance of speaking up, of reaching out. You've shown us that even the smallest act of kindness can set off a chain reaction of positivity. And for that we all thank you." The room erupted in applause, and Lily felt tears prick at her eyes. She hadn't done any of this for recognition. She had simply wanted to help. But seeing the impact of her actions, the way it had brought the community together, filled her with a sense of purpose and joy. As the applause died down, Lily felt a tug at her sleeve. It was Max, his eyes shining with admiration and something else, determination. "Lily," he whispered, "I want to say something to everyone, can I?" Lily nodded encouragingly, stepping aside to let Max take her place. She watched proudly as her friend cleared his throat, his voice shaky at first, but growing stronger with each word. I want to thank you all too," Max began. "When I first came to Maplewood Connections, I was angry and hurt. I didn't want to talk about my dad leaving, about how it made me feel. But being here, listening to all of your stories, sharing my own, it's helped me more than I can say." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I've learned that it's okay to feel sad or angry, but it's also okay to let those feelings out, to talk about them. And I've learned that when you do, you find out you're not alone. So thank you, all of you, for listening, for sharing, for caring." As Max finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Lily felt her heart swell with pride for her friend, for how far he had come. She saw his mother in the crowd, tears streaming down her face, a mix of sorrow and hope in her eyes. The gathering continued late into the night, filled with more stories, more laughter, more connections being forged and strengthened. As Lily looked around the room, she saw a community transformed. The silence that had once separated them had been replaced by a symphony of shared experiences, of lives, intertwined. Later that night, as Lily lay in bed replaying the events of the evening, she heard a soft knock at her door. Her father entered, sitting on the edge of her bed. "I'm so proud of you, Lily," he said softly. "You've done something truly remarkable." Lily smiled sleepily. "I didn't do it alone, Dad. Everyone helped. You, Mr. Abernathy, Margaret, Max, everyone who was brave enough to share their story." Michael nodded, stroking her hair gently. "That's true. But you were the catalyst, sweetheart. You showed us all the power of breaking silence, of reaching out. You've helped heal not just individual hearts, but our entire community." As Lily drifted off to sleep, she felt a deep sense of contentment. The journey that had begun with a simple note delivery had grown into something far beyond what she could have imagined. But she knew it wasn't over. There would always be more silences to break, more stories to share, more connections to make. And as the snow fell softly outside her window, blanketing Maplewood in a peaceful hush, Lily knew that she was ready for whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead. For she had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that in the space between silence and speech, in the courage to reach out and connect, lay the true power to change the world, one story at a time. As winter gave way to spring, the seeds of change planted in Maplewood continued to blossom and grow. The Maplewood Connections Group had become a model for surrounding communities, with delegations from neighboring towns often visiting to learn how they could replicate its success. Lily, now 8 years old, found herself at the center of this expanding network of care and communication. She had grown too, not just in height, but in wisdom and empathy. The shy, grief-stricken girl who had once sought solace in the whispers of strangers had become a beacon of hope for many in her community. One warm May afternoon, as Lily and Max were walking home from school, they noticed a moving truck parked in front of the house next door to Lily's. A family was unloading boxes, looking harried and overwhelmed. "Should we go help?" Max asked, his eyes bright with the desire to be useful. Lily nodded, already moving towards the new neighbors. "Hi there," she called out cheerfully. "Welcome to Maplewood." "I'm Lily, and this is Max. Can we help you with those boxes?" The mother, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, smiled gratefully. "That would be wonderful, thank you. I'm Sarah, and this is my husband, Tom. Our daughter, Emily, is around here, somewhere." As if on cue, a girl about Lily and Max's age peeked out from behind a large box. She had long, dark hair and eyes that seemed too serious for her young face. "Hi, Emily," Lily said warmly. "Want to help us carry some of the smaller boxes? We can show you around the neighborhood after if you'd like." Emily nodded shyly, and soon the three children were working alongside the adults, creating a chain to pass boxes into the house. As they worked, Lily and Max shared stories about Maplewood, telling Emily about their school, the best places to play, and of course about Maplewood connections. "It's this amazing group where people come together to talk and help each other," Lily explained enthusiastically. "Everyone's welcome. You and your parents should come to our next meeting." Emily's eyes widened with interest, but before she could respond, her father called her inside to help unpack. As Lily and Max said their goodbyes, promising to come back the next day, they couldn't help but notice the tension in Emily's shoulders, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Do you think she's okay?" Max asked as they walked away. "She seemed, I don't know, sad somehow." Lily nodded, her brow furrowed in concern. "I noticed that too. Maybe moving is harder for her than she's letting on. We'll just have to make sure she feels welcome and knows she can talk to us if she needs to." Over the next few weeks, Lily and Max made it their mission to include Emily in their activities. They invited her to play at the park, shared their favorite books, and introduced her to other kids in the neighborhood. Slowly, Emily began to open up, her smiles becoming more frequent and genuine. But Lily couldn't shake the feeling that there was something Emily wasn't saying, some weight she was carrying that kept her from fully embracing her new life in Maplewood. It all came to a head one afternoon at a Maplewood Connections meeting. Emily had finally agreed to come along with her parents, though she hung back shyly as introductions were made. As the meeting progressed and people began to share their stories, Lily noticed Emily becoming more and more agitated. Finally, as Mrs. Henderson was recounting a particularly poignant memory of her late husband, Emily burst into tears and ran from the room. Without hesitation, Lily followed her, finding her huddled on a bench outside the community center. "Emily?" Lily said softly, sitting down beside her friend. "What's wrong? You can tell me, you know, that's what friends are for." For a long moment, Emily said nothing, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she began to speak. We didn't just move here because of my dad's job," she said. "We moved because I was being bullied at my old school. It was awful, Lily. They said such mean things and no one would be my friend. I was so alone." Lily felt her heart clench at Emily's words. She reached out and took her friend's hand, squeezing it gently. "Oh, Emily, I'm so sorry that happened to you, but you're not alone anymore. You have us now." Emily looked up, her tear-stained face a mixture of hope and fear. "But what if it happens again? What if people here find out how weird and different I am and decide they don't like me either?" "Hey," Lily said firmly, "there's nothing wrong with being different, and anyone who says there is, well, they're the ones with the problem, not you. Besides, here in Maplewood, we celebrate differences. It's what makes our community special." As Lily continued to comfort Emily, she didn't notice the small crowd that had gathered at the door of the community center. Her father, Mr. Abernathy, Margaret, Max, and Emily's parents all stood watching, their faces a mixture of concern and pride. "You know," Lily continued, The whole point of Maplewood Connections is that everyone has a story. Everyone has struggles. And when we share them, when we listen to each other, we realize we're not so alone after all. Emily wiped her eyes, looking at Lily with a newfound understanding. Do you think I could share my story? In there? She asked hesitantly, nodding towards the community center. Lily smiled, standing up and offering her hand to Emily. I think that would be wonderful, and I'll be right there with you, every step of the way. As the two girls walked back into the community center hand in hand, a hush fell over the room. Emily, still trembling slightly but with a determined set to her shoulders, made her way to the front of the room. I have something I'd like to share, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. And as Emily began to tell her story, Lily saw the magic of Maplewood Connections working once again. Faces filled with empathy and understanding, nods of encouragement, and murmurs of support filled the room. By the time Emily finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. But mixed with the tears was a sense of triumph, of a burden, shared and lightened. Emily's parents, who had been hovering anxiously at the back of the room, rushed forward to embrace their daughter, their own faces a mix of sorrow for what she had endured and pride in her courage. As the meeting wound down, people gathered around Emily, offering words of support and sharing their own experiences with bullying and feeling different. Lily watched with a sense of awe as her friend, who had been so withdrawn and afraid, began to bloom under the warmth of acceptance and understanding. Later that evening, as Lily and her father walked home under a sky painted with the soft colors of sunset, Michael turned to his daughter with a look of pride. "You know, Lily," he said, softly, "what you did today, that was something truly special." Lily looked up at her father, curious. "What do you mean, Dad?" "I just listened to Emily and encouraged her to share her story. That's what we always do at Maplewood Connections." Michael nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Yes, but it's more than that. You saw someone in pain, someone struggling with silence, and you knew exactly how to help them find their voice. That's a rare gift, sweetheart." As they continued their walk home, Lily pondered her father's words. She thought about how far they had all come since that summer day when she had delivered Mr. Abernathy's note to Margaret. How one small act of kindness had grown into something that was changing their entire community. She thought about Max, who had found the strength to face his pain and anger over his father's departure. About Mrs. Henderson, whose house was now filled with the laughter of frequent visitors. About Mr. Abernathy and Margaret, whose love story had been given a second chance. And now Emily, who had found the courage to share her story and, in doing so, had taken the first step towards healing. As they reached their front porch, Lily turned to her father. "Dad," she said, her voice filled with determination, "I think I know what I want to do when I grow up." Michael raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, and what's that, sweetheart?" Lily's eyes shone with purpose as she replied, "I want to help people find their voices. I want to create spaces where everyone feels safe to share their stories, where no one has to feel alone or silenced." Michael felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at his daughter, seeing not just the little girl she was, but the remarkable woman she was becoming. He knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level. "Lily," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I think that's the most wonderful goal I've ever heard. And you know what? I think you've already started doing exactly that." As they embraced, the last rays of sunlight painting the world in soft gold, Lily felt a sense of rightness settle over her. She knew that the journey ahead would not always be easy. There would be more silences to break, more stories to uncover, more hearts to heal. But she also knew that she was not alone. She had her father, her friends, and an entire community behind her. Together they would continue to build bridges of understanding, to create spaces where every voice could be heard. As night fell over Maplewood, bringing with it a gentle hush, Lily knew that this was just the beginning. The symphony of voices that had started with a single note was growing louder, richer, more beautiful with each passing day. And she, Lily Thompson, would do everything in her power to ensure that every voice, no matter how small or hesitant, found its place in that glorious chorus. As summer once again blanketed Maplewood in warmth and light, the town hummed with a new energy. The changes that had begun with Lily's simple act of kindness had grown into a movement that touched every corner of the community. Maplewood Connections had expanded beyond its original scope, spawning various subgroups to address specific needs within the community. There was a support group for single parents, inspired by Max's mother's journey. A book club for seniors had formed, with Mrs. Henderson at its helm, bringing together older residents to share stories and combat loneliness. Even a youth mentorship program had taken root, pairing older teens with younger children who needed guidance and support. One sunny afternoon, as Lily, Max, and Emily were helping to set up for a community picnic in the park, they overheard a conversation that made them pause in their work. "I tell you, Martha," a man was saying to his wife as they strolled by, "this town has changed so much in the past year. Do you remember how it used to be? Everyone keeping to themselves, barely a hello exchanged on the street. And now look at us." Martha nodded, her face alight with a warm smile. "It's like we've all remembered how to be neighbors again, and to think it all started with that little girl and her act of kindness." As the couple moved out of earshot, Lily felt a blush creep up her cheeks. She still wasn't entirely comfortable with the attention her actions had garnered, preferring to focus on the work that still needed to be done. Emily, noticing Lily's discomfort, gave her friend a gentle nudge. "They're right, you know," she said softly. "You really did change things around here. I can't imagine what my life would be like if we'd moved to a different town." Max nodded in agreement. "Yeah, Lily. You helped all of us find our voices. You showed us that it's okay to speak up, to share our stories." Lily looked at her friends, feeling a swell of emotion in her chest. "I didn't do it alone," she said. "We all did this together. Every person who had the courage to share their story, every person who took the time to listen, they're all part of this change." As they continued setting up for the picnic, Lily's mind wandered to all the stories she had heard over the past year. Stories of loss and love, of struggle and triumph. Each one had added a thread to the tapestry of their community, creating a picture of resilience and hope. The picnic itself was a testament to how far they had come. People from all walks of life mingled freely, sharing food and laughter. Mr. Abernathy and Margaret, now officially engaged, were at the center of a group regaling them with well wishes. Mrs. Henderson had set up a storytelling corner where children and adults alike gathered to hear tales of Maplewood's past. As the afternoon wore on, Lily found herself sitting on a bench at the edge of the park, taking in the scene before her. Her father approached, 2 plates of food in hand. "Thought you might be hungry," Michael said, handing her a plate as he sat down beside her. Lily smiled gratefully, realizing she had been so caught up in helping others that she had forgotten to eat. As they sat in comfortable silence, enjoying their food and the warm summer air, Michael turned to his daughter. "You know, Lily," he began, his voice thoughtful, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened this past year, about how much you've grown, how much we've all grown." Lily looked up at her father, curious. "What do you mean, Dad?" Michael smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Well, when your mother died, I thought our world had ended. The silence that fell over our house, I didn't know how to break it. I didn't know how to reach you or how to let you reach me." Lily felt a lump form in her throat at the mention of her mother. Even now, the loss could still ache like a physical thing. "But you," Michael continued, his voice thick with emotion, "you found a way to break that silence, not just for us but for so many others. You reminded all of us, of the power of connection, of shared stories." He paused, looking out over the park where their friends and neighbors laughed and talked. "I think your mother would be so proud of you, Lily. I know I am." Lily felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were tears of joy, mixed with the bittersweet ache of missing her mother. She leaned into her father's side, feeling his arm wrap around her shoulders. "I miss her, Dad," she said softly. "I know, sweetheart. I miss her too. But you know what? I think in a way she's still with us, in the stories we share about her, in the love she taught us to give to others. She's here in every connection we make, every silence we break." As they sat together, watching the sun begin its descent towards the horizon, Lily felt a sense of peace settle over her. The journey that had begun with a simple desire to help Mr. Abernathy had led her to this moment, surrounded by a community that had become like family. She thought about all the lives that had been touched, all the stories that had been shared, about Max finding the strength to face his father's departure, about Emily overcoming her fear of being different, about Mr. Abernathy and Margaret rekindling a love that had been silenced for decades. And she thought about her own journey, how she had found her voice and her purpose in helping others find theirs. As the picnic began to wind down, people gathering blankets and leftover food, Lily stood up. She looked at her father, a determined glint in her eye. "Dad," she said, "I think it's time we did something more. Something bigger." Michael raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What did you have in mind, sweetheart?" Lily took a deep breath, her mind racing with possibilities. I think we should write a book about Maplewood connections, about all the stories we've heard, all the silences we've broken. Maybe if we share our story, it could help other communities do the same thing." Michael's face broke into a wide smile. "Lily," he said, his voice filled with pride, "I think that's a wonderful idea, and I know just the person to help us get started." As they walked towards Margaret, who had experience in publishing from her years working at the bookstore, Lily felt a thrill of excitement. This was just the beginning of a new chapter, not just for her but for all of Maplewood. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. As darkness fell, the park was illuminated by strings of twinkling lights casting a warm glow over the remaining picnickers. The air was filled with the soft murmur of conversations, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter. Lily looked around at the faces of her friends and neighbors, each one with a story to tell, each one a testament to the power of breaking silence and fostering connection. She knew that there would always be more work to do, more stories to uncover, more silences to break. But as she stood there, surrounded by the community she had helped to build, Lily Thompson knew one thing for certain. Together, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. For in the symphony of voices that had started with a single note, they had found strength, healing, and hope. And that, she realized, was the most powerful story of all. The warm summer days gradually gave way to the crisp air of autumn, bringing with it a sense of new beginnings. The Thompson house, once shrouded in silence, now buzzed with activity as Lily and her father worked on their book project. Their dining room table had become a makeshift office, covered in notebooks filled with stories, photographs of community, events and rough drafts of chapters. Margaret, true to her word, had been an invaluable resource, guiding them through the intricacies of turning their community's journey into a compelling narrative. One September evening, as Lily and Michael were poring over their notes, the doorbell rang. Lily jumped up to answer it, finding Mr. Abernathy and Margaret on the porch, hand in hand. "We hope we're not interrupting," Margaret said with a warm smile, "but we have some news we wanted to share with you both in person." As they settled in the living room, Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat, a mixture of nervousness and excitement in his eyes. "We've set a date for the wedding," he announced, "and well, we were hoping that Lily might do us the honor of being our flower girl." Lily's eyes widened in surprise and delight. "Really? Oh, I'd love to," she exclaimed, jumping up to hug them both. As the adults discussed wedding details, Lily's mind wandered to how far they had all come. Mr. Abernathy, once too afraid to even speak to Margaret, was now planning their wedding. It was a powerful reminder of how much could change when people found the courage to break their silence and reach out to one another. The next day at school, Lily shared the exciting news with Max and Emily. As they sat together at lunch, Emily looked thoughtful. "You know," she said, "I've been thinking about everything that's happened since I moved here. How scared I was to make friends, to let anyone know about my past, and now look at us." Max nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I never thought I'd be able to talk about my dad leaving without feeling angry all the time. But sharing my story, hearing others, it's helped so much." Lily felt a warmth spread through her chest as she looked at her friends. "That's what Maplewood Connections is all about," she said, "helping people realize they're not alone, that their stories matter." As autumn progressed, work on the book continued. Lily and her father interviewed community members, capturing their stories of transformation and connection. Mrs. Henderson shared tales of how the senior book club had brought new life to many of her peers. Max's mother spoke about the support she'd found in the single parents group. Even Emily contributed, writing a powerful chapter about overcoming bullying and finding acceptance in her new home. One crisp October afternoon, as golden leaves drifted past the window of the community center, Lily stood before the gathered members of Maplewood Connections. Her heart pounded with a mixture of nervousness and excitement as she prepared to share their progress on the book. "We've come so far together," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "From that first meeting, when we were all a little unsure and afraid, to now. We've laughed together, cried together, and most importantly, we've learned to listen to each other." As Lily spoke, she saw nods of agreement and encouraging smiles from around the room. Mr. Abernathy and Margaret sat hand in hand, their faces beaming with pride. Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Max and Emily grinned encouragingly from the front row. "This book," Lily continued, holding up a thick binder of drafts, "is not just our story. It's a roadmap for other communities, a testament to what can happen when we break the silence that keeps us apart. It's a reminder that every voice matters. Every story deserves to be heard." As she finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. People stood up, hugging each other, their faces alight with emotion and purpose. Lily felt a hand on her shoulder and looked up to see her father, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Your mother would be so proud of you," he whispered, pulling her into a tight hug. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of her community, Lily felt the presence of her mother more strongly than she had in years. She could almost hear her voice encouraging her to keep going, to keep breaking silences and building connections. As the meeting wound down and people began to leave, many stopping to share a kind word or a hug with Lily, she found herself standing by the window, looking out at the town she had grown to love even more deeply over the past year. Maplewood had changed. There was no doubt about that. But more than the new programs or the increased community events, it was the spirit of the town that had transformed. People walked down the street with their heads held high, greeting each other warmly. Neighbors looked out for one another, offering help and support without hesitation. Lily knew that their work was far from over. There would always be new challenges to face, new silences to break, new stories to be told. But she also knew that they were ready to face whatever came their way together. As the last rays of sunlight painted the autumn leaves in brilliant hues of red and gold, Lily felt a sense of peace and purpose wash over her. The journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness had grown into something far beyond what she could have imagined. But in the end, it all came back to the power of words spoken and stories shared, to the courage it takes to break silence and reach out to another person, to the healing that can happen when we realize we're not alone. Lily Thompson, once a quiet girl seeking noise in the whispers of strangers, had found her voice. And in doing so, she had helped an entire community find theirs. As she turned away from the window, ready to join her father and friends, Lily knew that this was not an ending, but a beginning, a new chapter in their ongoing story of connection, courage, and the transformative power of breaking silence. The future stretched out before them, full of possibility and hope. And Lily was ready to face it. One story, one connection, one broken silence at a time. You may also like one of the 2 videos on your screen. Feel free to watch them now or subscribe to the channel to watch them later. Thanks for watching.